So good morning. It is indeed my pleasure to be here with all of you, and the more I learn about this project and this community, the more excited I got to come here today and spend the day with you and help to try to make real this kind of emerging approach to poverty alleviation that, if you say it's the one thing, sometimes we say the goal is to keep the goal, right? And so at the end of the day, when you think about transforming opportunity over generation, that not so good. Wow. I'm just going to hold it down like this. When we think about transforming opportunity over generation.
Well, you have to have this mic too, though.
Oh,
Yeah.
that one there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we're going to have to have
Stand
both.
still. How's that? Closer to it. Okay.
There we go.
Versus farther away. When we think about that, it does mean that the choices we make matter. And I think what I want to share with you some this morning is understanding how, in addition to jobs, in addition to traditional economic development strategies that are incredibly important to bringing future opportunities to Jefferson County, there is something incredibly valuable about unpacking household balance sheets and understanding how individual families think about the future and actually have the opportunities to save and invest in that future, and have that strategy go along with the strategies that are happening in the community. So we want to share a little bit about that entire process. And to start that off, I actually want you all to share at your tables for just a minute. I would love for you to take a minute to turn to the person beside you and talk about your first memory that you learned about money. It can be a bad memory, it can be a good memory, but just share with somebody at your table the first memory you have about money and savings, or money and bills, anything like that.
How old were you when you got your first job?
Okay, the lull has quieted down at this point. There's more faces up than down. Would anybody be willing to share what they talked about?
My very first one was when I was small, when I first got my first money from my parents for doing chores. And she don't want me to tell how much I pay, but I got to tell. I got $5 for my chores. And instead of me spending my money, when I go to the store, I would leave my money home and spend their money. It was a good way of saving. I kind of want to go back there because then I can leave my money home and let hubby spend his money.
Excellent.
So that's my first experience.
Thank you. That's great. Anybody else care to share?
What I did with what my first experience with money isn't relative necessarily given the whole group that we were talking about. It seems, myself included, our first experience with money is still our impression today. It molded who we were. My first experience was, if I only spend this much this week, this much this week, this much this week, I'll have money all month long. And I still live that today. My base is never at risk. I've never mortgaged a house. Although I've owned 3 of them, I've never mortgaged one. I still say, if I spend this much time, and I budget this way, I'll still have money over there. And the same thing came from my colleagues here today. Good stuff.
That's great. And of course, the converse can also be true. If you're growing up in a household where the money doesn't last the full month, and you experience that month after month growing up, then that can also set your mindset. And this is really where the foundation of CFED's work has come from over the years. We're a nonprofit that's been around for about 30 years. We did a lot of economic development work at the beginning, and increasingly, as people started writing about poverty alleviation strategies that really got to the families in the community, so it's not just about bringing in business from the outside, but how do you create opportunity from the inside, it became essential to look at these saving strategies and to look at families' motivations. And yet there's this kind of larger cultural discussion that the poor can't save, right? That low-income people can't save. So poverty alleviation strategies have been very much focused on income transfers or income subsidy, month-to-month kinds of assistance projects. What the kind of work that CFED and Angela's work and what you'll hear about all day long is that time and again over the last 20 years with the kind of projects we try to start to help people buy houses, send their kids to college, save for the future, and save for a rainy day, is that everybody, including low-income households, can save, they want to save, they can save at rates higher than a lot of other people in the community, but oftentimes the structures and the systems that we have in place don't help them do that. And so it is a matter of trying to figure out what new needs to happen to help to really kind of seed that idea or build on that idea. So I encourage you to keep tapping into that. Where did you learn and what did you learn? And it can be a taboo conversation, but it's actually an incredibly helpful conversation to have in a community when you want to start thinking about the one big thing that becomes transformational for a community. I guess the last kind of data point I'd say about why we're talking about this whole idea of assets, and I'll go into what that means really, and not sticking with income and jobs is not because that's not a fundamentally important piece of the puzzle. It absolutely is. But over the last, well, I'd say always in many cases, but especially over the last few years, we've started to confuse the idea of middle class and middle income. And this idea that income gets you all the way to financial security isn't the case, right? You knew that you couldn't use the whole base, right? You knew that there had to be something else there. There's some really shocking statistics, and these are not going in the right direction in America. When you think about, and this is a research group in DC that did this, but when they looked at African American households that were solidly middle income, 45% of children in those households fell into the bottom income bracket by the time they were adults, compared to only 16% of whites. And these were in the exact same income bracket. So there was something besides income, even in middle income households, that matters. And that matters. What made that sticky in the middle wasn't just the income, it was the assets that were held. It was the inheritance that was transferred, or the down payment for the house, or the college savings and semester that you could afford to do. And so what we're saying is that even as we're looking at the importance of the equivalent of 33,000 jobs in Jefferson County, we also have to figure out what is the stuff that makes income sticky for families. How do you do more with what you have so that households can do more in the future for themselves as well? And that's another reason why the public-private idea here, the public investment, the private investment in households themselves is very compelling, and we'd like to share some stories about how that goes forward. And I know between Angela and I, we'll hope to kind of make this feel really quite real for you. Michael Sheridan is the person who wrote the book Assets and the Poor, which was really the thing that got started this whole idea of not just income, but also assets, focusing on developing programs that actually help families do this. That very few people have spent their way out of poverty, that in fact they escape through savings and investing in the long term. And what we know about the kinds of programs and policies are that for the most part, if you have a lot of wealth and means, the tax code is your primary way to build wealth, right? You get deductions for your home mortgage interest deduction and things like that. But if you have a lower income, you actually can't claim those deductions. And so a lot of the ways that the country helps build wealth, we used to do it through the GI Bill, we did it through the Homestead Act. There's lots of ways that we've helped people build wealth over the years. But for lower income folks, we need to figure out new ways of doing that. So when I talk about assets, we really are talking about a whole range of things. There's bank accounts and savings accounts. There's real estate and land, which is certainly in abundance here. There's businesses and business ownership, which is second only to home ownership in terms of where people's wealth actually is held in this country. We think of education as one of these fundamental investments, and it's really exciting to hear about the increase in the high school graduation rates that's been happening in the trends in this. That's incredibly exciting. There's certainly additional kinds of investments for retirement and also just in the stock market. That is not where the majority of Americans actually, even though it's the kind of wide-eyed place that we all hear about, it's really not where most people build their wealth. And especially what we know about home ownership and the growing wealth gap between African American and white households, we are seeing that the drivers of that really have been more about when families buy a home or how much inheritance they receive. And it's been a lot of things besides the stock market. There's not a lot of diversification into stocks for most households in America. In addition to this, though, we like to broaden the idea of assets, and there's certainly the way that you broaden it by thinking of natural assets and natural capital, and what are the resources that you're rich in your community, and how do you get to fit the entire community to benefit from those assets. And I think this project overall is an incredible example of how we can think together about doing that. But there's other ideas that have really come into play lately, and I'll show you some data. It's not just having savings, it's having a savings account. That's actually an asset. Having the kind of accounts that enable you to save, having the kinds of systems in place, that really matters as well. And so what we're going to, good credit, and we'll talk about that as well. You can't get a job anymore, or certainly buy a house. A lot of things that enable you to move up that ladder have to do with your credit. And you start building bad credit a lot earlier in life than you think, unless you're aware of what's driving that. So we are going to try to kind of prime people, and the nice thing is that some of these infrastructure pieces, some of these building block pieces, are the kinds of things that you can be thinking about and doing something about in relatively easy ways with relatively low dollar costs right away in a community. We certainly know that having assets helps family move beyond the paycheck-to-paycheck existence. And I don't know how big the conversation in your county has been around kind of payday loans and pay advances, but in a lot of the country, that is how families are making it between paychecks, is they're taking on the kind of advance loan that then they might roll over 3 or 4 different times, or 5 or 6 different times, and they'll end up paying 300% and 400% interest on those dollars. If you can imagine having a little bit aside to be able to draw on from your own money for those same gap times, then that looks very different, and families can begin to save in different ways. We know that assets create a financial buffer to weather emergencies. And there's other research, and I won't bore you all with all the research, but some of this is really interesting. Families who had savings and then had a financial crisis, if they were in the lowest income bracket and they had that emergency savings buffer, when you look at how well they were able to withstand that economic crisis, they looked like they were a family in the whole next income bracket. So you can be a low income, but if you have that financial cushion, your ability to withstand that job loss or that emergency room visit or any of the car repair made it look for you long term like you were already in a whole different income bracket. So savings matters that much in terms of helping you weather those unexpected, but they always happen, economic shocks. We also know that savings improve the well-being of families and children. And we'll show a lot of that, but there is some really interesting new research just showing that children from households that save versus children from households that don't save have extraordinarily improved outcomes, educational outcomes and life outcomes. And again, it doesn't even matter the amount of that savings so much as the ownership of the account. We know that savings is linked to lower rates of divorce and of domestic violence. There's a whole lot of stuff going on in the country around healthy marriage initiatives and looking at the household formation. There's some really interesting research that shows that the ownership of a car or of even a small account explains more of the marriage gap between African American households and white households than employment, whether or not there's been incarceration, than all of the other kind of normal explanations combined. And so it's almost the cart before the horse. It's like, okay, well, you can start with household counseling in terms of the types of things that would support a healthy marriage, or you can start with basic financial coaching that helps people avoid the kind of conflicts that drive domestic disputes in many ways and make things happen in a way that reduces your capacity to stay together as a family. So we're really learning a lot about the different ways that the role of savings and assets contributes to the kind of financial security and stability long term that does set a community and a household up for the kind of enduring success that Carlton talked about at the very beginning. There's a few books up front. We talk about assets being hope in concrete form. I do think that that's the piece that we're talking about here, is if you can get people excited about the fact that a different way of approaching hard problems really is happening in communities around the country right now, and it's happening in rural places around the country right now. Getting exposed to those ideas and getting excited about what can happen here is completely doable. And I have to say, from my perspective, the opportunity here is incredibly unique. You don't most of the communities we work in that are talking about these strategies, these asset building strategies, aren't talking about it in conjunction with an income stream that might actually support this kind of effort in a long-term way in a community. So the opportunity here is profoundly different than every place else I'm seeing in America right now. It's really quite exciting. So let me give you a couple of quick facts around what we know about household financial security. And we don't have this data in deep detail for Jefferson County right now. We can pull this, and this is something we'll talk about, some of this kind of information. How do we actually get it really down to the ground here? But let me give you a flavor of what we know about the United States and Georgia in particular. We release a report every year called the Assets and Opportunities Scorecard. It looks across all 50 states at 101 different measures of household financial security and policies around what promotes household financial security. And one of the biggest issues that we talk about is this idea of liquid asset poverty. It's really just another word for emergency savings, rainy day savings. But the idea is, if you were to lose your job tomorrow, if you were to lose your main source of income, would you be able to live just at the poverty line as a household for 3 months without that source of income? 44% of the country does not have access to the amount of funds, which is only about $4,000, to keep themselves out of poverty for 3 months if they lost their job. I know that in some communities where we have done the local data, that's upwards of 70% of households that don't have that $4,000 cushion. And it's not just in it certainly is correlated with income in some ways, but when you look at even households that are pretty well off, making, in terms of income, making between $50,000 and $90,000, it's still over 25% of households nationally that don't have that financial cushion. So if you couple that with this idea of not having enough to be sticky, to stay in a relatively stable financial situation, it's a pretty big national problem. And then in addition to that, the problem is that these tools I talked about, a lot of families don't even have the tools to help begin to fix that problem. So what we know nationally is that 30% of households don't even have a savings account. And we know that 1 in 8 households doesn't have even a bank account, a transaction type of account. We know that overall in the country, borrowers are carrying about $11,000 in credit card debt. Education debt is even higher these days. It's now surpassed credit card debt for families that have debt. We know that half of consumers in this country have what would be considered a subprime credit score. That would mean that you couldn't get that best rate that draws you in, right, for the car loan or the home loan or things like that. So 56% of Americans, and again, in a few of the cities we've worked in, I've seen that number be 70% of people with a subprime credit score. And we also know, again, 1 in 5 households are underbanked, meaning they might have an account, but they still use an alternative financial product or service 1 or more times a year. And those often can be very high cost and can lead to a lot of additional hardship on the family. And in terms of what we just talked about, we do know for Georgia that in terms of the income poverty rate, the liquid asset poverty rate, which is looking like 55% in Georgia, right? Almost 56%. Households with savings accounts, almost 40% of households in Georgia don't have savings accounts as a basic access piece. So I don't want to belabor the points here. We do know for Jefferson County, and these are not the most recent data, but we haven't recomputed this now that the new data is available, but 1 in 5 households didn't have a bank account in Jefferson County. And this was with 2009 data. And we knew that 1 in 4 households, a little over 1 in 4, had an account but was still using other kinds of financial services that were much higher cost for many of the kinds of transactions. A lot of times you see this if people pay rent, a landlord requires a money order, or they require something that you can't write a personal check on those things. So this is where a lot of times, or they're using that payday loan or something like that. So they have an account, but they use it to actually do other types of things that are higher cost for them. And again, we know that 8.5% of households have a bachelor's degree or higher. We know the high school graduation rates are increasing, but again, as Carlton said, we know that the future job opportunities really do require post-secondary education. So some of the strategies really want to figure out how do you translate this increasing high school graduation rate into opportunities for more people to go to and succeed in college, and ideally in ways while you actually are also pursuing the economic development strategies that make this a place that folks can come home to and have a job and actually be returning to with their young families. So how do you do this? How do you do this? And I think that we have a strategy that we take as a model. If you want to try to build household financial security for kids and for adults, learn, earn, save, invest, protect is the framework that we use about how do you do this. And what we mean by that is that in terms of learn, you certainly need to learn in terms of the education and the skills for being able to succeed in the labor market, but you also need the kinds of education and skills that enable you to succeed in financial markets, in figuring out how to navigate loans and interest and savings accounts and balancing checkbooks and budgets. And we don't teach that as much anymore. We don't teach it. You're born into families that have it, or you're not. We don't make the same kind of opportunities for that. Translating that into earn. Now, it's not just the income you earn, but it's how do you maximize the kind of dollars that are coming into your house. So there's a lot with lower income households with earned income tax credit and with child care tax credits and things that really can help build the bottom line of that family. And there's strategies around making sure that the maximum number of families in the community are tapping into those kinds of income supports. And also and that really can help in the long run. It can help not only to help those families make more money, but also to save some of that money. And then there's the translation of earning into saving for the future. So it's both about reducing costs and increasing the overall household budget sheet. How do you leverage that into the kinds of investments that help people buy a house, go to college, start a business, save for a rainy day? And over top of all of that, it's not just about education. I think that we lose that a lot of times. It's also about making sure that families are protected in the financial marketplace. So it's not a you're on your own completely situation. It's how do we make sure that the most harmful kinds of products and services have alternatives in the community? And how do you make sure that people have the insurance that they need so that those emergencies don't translate into a downward spiral? In terms of the strategies, we'll go into depth in some of the workshop activities this afternoon around some of the strategies that communities around the country are starting to do to make these concepts real in terms of the kind of programs and services that are offered in the community. And I think the idea here is to give you all a whole toolbox to think about as you think about the kinds of vision you want to build for Jefferson County and the kinds of programs and services you want to have there to help families succeed. There's certainly a lot going on learning what works in terms of financial coaching around the country. This idea that one-on-one financial coaching isn't just for people that have wealth managers anymore, but that everybody needs that kind of help. And there's some really interesting data showing that that kind of financial education and coaching at the right time, at a decision point in their life, can make a huge difference. There is a lot going on also with EARN in terms of free tax preparation. Has anybody ever heard of a VITA site? Is there a VITA site in Jefferson County? Okay, so VITA is voluntary income tax assistance program. It's funded by the IRS, but a lot of communities also fund into it, and it's basically free tax prep help. And we'll discuss this a little bit more. We know it works for families. We know it works to bring a lot more dollars into the local economy because those families can get that money. There's savings, investment. We'll just touch on a few of these here and then move out of the way. So we talked about financial education and credit repair. Getting families banked. There's a lot going on around the country in terms of helping families get banked and get these savings accounts. And there's things called Bank On USA. There's financial access programs. These work wonderfully when they become a public-private partnership. So a lot of times it's the community government, it's the treasurer in a town, connected with the banks in the town, connected with the nonprofits, or the people who are wanting to offer financial education, and figuring out then how do you help people open those accounts and how do you help them use those accounts. And that's an exciting piece of the work that's happening, again, in rural areas around the country as well as in municipalities, larger places. Making the most of tax time. This idea of free tax prep is just exploding around the country. There are thousands of these voluntary income tax assistance sites around the country now. They happen at employers, they happen in schools, they happen at community colleges, they happen in low-cost ways that really can benefit the family, and increasingly, there's ways that people are adding on other kinds of services when people come in for that tax prep house. This is, for many families, the largest influx of cash they're going to get the entire year. It could be $4,000, it could be $3,000. It's a big chunk of money. Helping them put some of that in savings is an incredibly exciting new innovation. There's some projects going on around the country called Save USA, where if you agree to put some of your tax return in a savings account and you keep it there for a year, they will match that 50 cents on the dollar up to $500, and that's your money at the end of that time to use for whatever kind of rainy day or emergency you need. What we're finding from that research is that the families that are saving make less than $17,000 a year. 70% of the families doing that keep the money in the entire year, and that's hard work for them because they're making really hard choices about how much they can do and how much they can put away. Not only 70% of them are saving for the entire year, but 70% of them are rolling it into the next year to do it again and starting other kinds of savings goals as well. So that's an exciting innovation that's really showing some positive outreach for households. And that's happening because of tax time, because it's that moment when people are primed to think about their money, and so that's the right time to start kind of having the conversation. Some of the more interesting things, and people laugh that I got my job because my name's Ida, and individual development accounts have been around for about 20 years now, so I thought this was a good job, and I'll stick with it until they change the name of the account. This is for more of those longer-term savings we talked about, the ones that really build those enduring assets. We know we need emergency savings, and we know we need long-term assets. And this is a dollar-for-dollar match. Has anybody heard of individual development accounts before? A couple of you? So this started about 20 years ago. CFED and some others did a pilot. Angela, were you part of the IDA pilot in Arkansas? This idea that if a household comes in and they want to save toward a goal and they're low income, there would be at least a dollar for match. Depending on how much the community and others can raise, it can be an 8-to-1 match at times. They can save for that and put it toward buying a home, starting a business, going to college themselves, or any kind of secondary education. Other people use it for car purchases, for home repairs. There's a lot of different ways you can innovate using an individual development account. In addition to that, in addition to the actual match, there's financial education, there's work on that credit score, and there's oversight of the kind of financial product you use once you make that purchase. We did some research recently with communities around the country who had used IDAs for home purchases, and what we found were that we looked at everybody in the community who was buying a home who was a low-income person over the last 10 years. And we looked at those who had bought using an IDA. And what we found was that the IDA homeowners were mostly from communities of color, and they were mostly women, compared to the people who were buying in the rest of the low-income community, which were mainly white households, and they were mainly well, it was a joint household, but it was not a single female purchase. And we found that foreclosure rates were 3 times less for people who had bought with an IDA. And we're not saying the IDA was a silver bullet. We're saying it's the bundle, the oversight, the financial education, the careful time repairing your credit and thinking about that. So that really seems to be quite an important finding, and these happen around the country. There's a lot of places, and we'll talk about this in depth, and Angela will talk much more about IDAs. And the final one that I'll leave you with here is this idea of children's savings accounts. So we did the pilot with individual development accounts, and oftentimes we were left with, if these are the kind of outcomes you can get when you start with adults, what could you do if you start with helping children save? What could you do if you started then? And parents will often do for themselves what they're not going to do for their kids, what they won't do for themselves. And so how do you actually take this idea of match savings and put it in the schools and think about setting up that kind of account for the long term? Talk about building aspiration. This is one of the most exciting things we're doing. We did a pilot in 12 communities around the country. This was one place where Angela was deeply engaged, and she can talk much more about this in detail from an experience perspective on the ground in a rural area. But incredibly exciting work, and as you'll see, and I'll show a little video that just came out last week, PBS just did a special on a college savings program that we helped to start in Mississippi, in Jackson. And so now there's 3 different places in the country where we're really looking at universal savings. Cuyahoga County in Ohio, their city council just passed 9-2 last week, a resolution that every single kid that goes to kindergarten in that school system in the county of Cuyahoga is going to start school with a savings account. San Francisco is doing the same thing. Every kid going to school there starts with a savings account. And it's seeded with dollars, so it has real money in it, and there's a match on every dollar that that family saves. It gets matched, either 50 cents on the dollar or dollar for dollar up to a certain amount. And that money is used to help not just pay for college later, but set the expectations of the family that that kid's going to go to college. And it's really quite an exciting innovation, and we're looking forward to thinking with you about what the opportunity for something like that might be in a place like Jefferson County, if that's one of the things on the menu that really starts to appeal for you. And I'll let the data show for you, but we have seen, again, promising information here, and I'll stop with the statistics. There's a trial going on in Oklahoma where they gave the accounts at birth, and they randomized access to them at birth. And now, 4 years out from the beginning of that trial, they just put a journal article out that showed that, and it's kind of the what the heck effect, you know? You're not quite sure what's driving this, and so there's lots of questions to be answered. But families who have those savings accounts in their child's name, the emotional and social cognitive development of those kids at 4 years old compared to the control group is a bigger difference than kids that are going to Head Start. So we don't know quite what's happening, except that you're priming the parents' ideas and aspirations for their kids, which might engage them more in how the kids might be reading, what they might be doing with them. We also know that people who have an account in their name, kids who have an account in their name versus kids who don't, if they had been planning to go to college, they're 6 times more likely to actually go and complete college if they had that account. And again, it's not a silver bullet, but there's something going on about how it sets people's aspirations. And I think it sets them not just for the kid and the household, I think it sets them for the community when you do this at a community-wide level.